Hey, AP Lang students, this is Kevin Steinhauser at Fiveable. Today we'll be looking at thesis statements and continuing to look at rhetorical analysis. So last week and actually the week before, we just were diving into thinking critically through a text. Well, today we're going to start getting practical. We're going to walk before we run though. What I mean by that is we're just going to master thesis statements. Now I know that seems a little weird coming from an AP like content. Why we're looking at thesis statements so in depth is just the old cliche. If you have a solid thesis statement, you are setting yourself up for success on the rest of the essay. So we'll look at effective thesis statements for synthesis and argumentation later on this year through Fiveable. Today, I'm looking all in on rhetorical analysis. Rhetorical analysis is definitely going to look different than the other two essays when it comes to thesis statement and just how we craft our paper. So really quickly want to talk about where we're headed through Fiveable. All of our live sessions are actually going to remain free in October. You'll just have to pay for any replays. Why we're doing that is just to get a lot of us going on the live sessions, but we also want to make the replays available. So it's kind of a compromise for the month of October. If you're ever not able to make a live session, please go back and look at those replays. Especially for mine, when I'm in units, it makes total sense to jump right in today. But if you haven't watched the last couple, I definitely encourage you to go back and in order if you ever missed them, right? So today we're looking at thesis statements for, here, let me get it set up here, rhetorical analysis. Let's launch into the PowerPoint. I call this one sentence to rule them all. So very clearly, this is the most important sentence in your paper. Now let's just be clear about it. You can write a 9 essay without a beautiful thesis statement. So I'm not saying thesis statement, like it's not like a lot of, like, for example, AP US or AP Psych, a lot of AP exams where you earn like 9 points and there's 9 things you have to do to earn part of your score. It's very holistic. So when I say one sentence to rule them all, I'm just saying this is thinking like a high-level thinker, translating it into writing. It needs to be in my thesis statement, so we're going to focus on that today. But really just focusing on a holistic way that we're scored, a holistic way that we should be viewing ourselves as writers. So it's not like I just got to do 9 things and I'm done. Everything's just on a skill. So I'm thinking at a high level, I'm translating into writing. Quick review. I've gone over this through Fiveable here a couple times. So I'm not going to take too much time, but I always want to ground our thoughts in rhetorical analysis on the triangle. Again, we got 3 parts of the triangle: the subject of the work, the audience, and the speaker. Really what I want you all to focus on, what's going to focus us on higher level thinking, higher level analysis, is that bridge between audience and subject. What does the audience already think about the subject at hand? And how is the speaker deliberately impacting their thoughts and either changing their thoughts or reinforcing what they already believe? Of course, that depends if the speaker and the audience are already aligned in their thoughts on the subject. So that's just, in a nutshell, what we have to be thinking of every time we read someone else's argument. What does the audience think about the subject? And how is the speaker getting the audience to move in one direction or another? All right, so let's get practical. The rest of the time today, let's talk about thesis statements. Thesis statements, you've probably been doing them since you were in 4th, 5th grade. Like, you've been doing them for years. Not much has changed, but I'm gonna teach you how to kind of go away from that like 5-paragraph thesis statement, like cookie cutter thesis statement that we see so often at the AP reading, and kind of go higher level than that. Before we do that, let's just touch base. I recommend, just like your teachers have since middle school, that the thesis statement goes as the last sentence of your introduction paragraph. So in 2 weeks, we'll talk about an effective introduction paragraph. This is obviously a key component of it. This is not a hard and fast rule. I've read 9 essays where the thesis statement is at the end. To be honest with you, I've read 9 essays, like I said at the beginning today, that don't even have a clear thesis statement, but that is so rare. That's not what I want to address today. The best papers will have a solid thesis. I want to make sure you all have a solid thesis statement. So that's what we're going to work on today. So here's the components of an effective thesis statement. We've really got 3 things to look at, and we're just going to hammer out today. I'm sure every single person watching this Fiveable video, either live or through replay, knows the components of a good thesis statement and is used to writing solid thesis statements. But I want them to be perfect. So I'm going to tell you what I call a perfect thesis statement. And I'll show you some examples today of what a good thesis statement is, but I really want to go from good to perfect when it comes to thesis. And by the way, there's a lot of ways I could word it to be perfect. I just mean there's no flaws in it. So the first thing we do need to include is a precise account of who the audience is. We'll work on that a little bit today. I'll give you a couple examples. The audience does not need to be too specific. It does not need to be too broad, but we do want to make sure it's exactly right. So it's kind of like the Goldilocks rule. Not too specific, not too broad, but we're getting it just right. And obviously that depends on the prompt in front of us. So second, we have to nail the author's purpose. College Board will generally not give you like a word for word, this is the purpose. The lingo, or I guess the wording that they'll have is something along these lines. How does the author convey her message on blank? So sometimes they'll give you the the subject, the message on blank, but they won't tell you what the message is. So we'll look at that today as well. But we're going to bring ourselves to the table. As I'm reading through the rhetorical analysis prompt, I'm thinking through what is the purpose. That's the number one thing on my mind, because then again, how is the author achieving the purpose? That's the whole point of this task. Third, and I'm going to be honest, this is the hardest part, mention the general trend of the choices the writer made. A lot of you are taught to do this. The author does blank through X, Y, Z. The X, Y, Z, my 3 body paragraphs. Please do not list strategies there. And I'm gonna show you what that looks like here in a minute. Please do not say Martin Luther King proves his purpose through strong diction, emotional appeal, and concrete evidence. If you're organizing through a strategy, that's okay. And I'll kind of talk about that in the coming weeks. If you're organizing through like what's worth writing about, means I have 2 or 3 really solid body paragraphs about the most important thing. And hey, maybe Martin Luther King, like one of the most important things he does is use emotional appeal. But I don't want that in my thesis. That seems too cookie cutter. That sounds like every other essay that I've already read. Let's step it up a notch. So I'll show you some examples of that today. And honestly, it's just something I want you practicing. Again, the best part about Fiveable and the best part about you being here is that we are deliberately practicing the college skills, AP level skills, in October, November, December, January, February, March, April, May. We've got time to work on this. And we're going to be hitting the ground running right now. So we're not currently at this junior or the senior level. We're only focused on the college level. And we're going to practice at the college level all year long to get a 3, a 4, or a 5 when it comes time to test in May. All right, you might want to write this down just as a format to go back to. This is not the end all be all. Again, this is just what I think is the easiest way to make sure you're hitting what you want to hit. I love the phrase, so I bolded it, in order to. When you say those 3 words in writing, you're forcing yourself to talk about the purpose. And if you talk about the purpose, you are good to go. You are doing what you need to do. Let's read it. In order to convince the audience, again, you're being precise there, that purpose, again, you're being precise there. Use the author's last name. When I say author, that's just the formal way to write. And then generally state what the author does, not simply listing ethos, diction, and syntax. Like, we're not doing that. We're looking for the bigger trend. Again, I'll show you some examples here in a minute. So as you might be writing that down, you can flip it too, right? You could say the author generally state what he does or she does, convinces the audience, blah, blah, blah. You can flip those 2 pieces. I like starting with in order to, because that's just varying up my sentence structure, starting with that prepositional phrase, that clause with that prepositional phrase at the beginning. So again, you could do it flipped. I'll show you when it gets more practical instead of me reading all these like hypothetical pieces. I'll jump into an example and I'll flip it so you can see how it can be worded either way. But again, I like starting with in order to because something that high-level writers do is vary their sentence structure. So this kind of flips the normal way I would write it. Here's our model thesis. So let's look at just how all these components are put together. So let me read it. Last week we talked about Ronald Reagan's Challenger address. So that's where I took this model thesis from. You don't have to have seen last week's live session for this to make sense, but obviously it's going to be exactly what I would write about if I was writing a rhetorical analysis essay on Ronald Reagan's speech that we looked at last week. So my thesis would say, in order to convince Americans of the importance of moving forward while mourning the tragic loss of these 7 astronauts, Reagan both celebrates the lives of those lost and recognizes the importance of keeping the space program's goals intact. I'm going to read it back to you, but flipping it. So if I were just to start with the subject, Reagan both celebrates the lives of those lost and recognizes the importance of keeping the space program's goals intact in order to convince Americans of the importance of moving forward while mourning the tragic loss of these 7 astronauts. So either way works. What I want to make sure, though, is all components are present and accurate. So I didn't say his audience, I said Americans. I didn't say his purpose, I said of the importance of moving forward, blah, blah, blah. Here's the part that a lot of students struggle with as we make this shift. So read with me again after Reagan. This is my generalizing of what he is doing throughout the entire speech. This is not simply saying Reagan uses emotional appeal and blah, 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 blah. So Reagan both celebrates the lives of those lost and recognizes the importance of keeping the space program's goals intact. That's something along those lines. We'll look at a couple other examples today, but something I want you practicing deliberately all year, and just get feedback from your teacher as you go. Hey, I saw this on Fiveable. What do you think about my thesis statement? What do you think about me generalizing about the trend of the writer? Again, I hope your teacher is on the side of not lists. Even if they're teaching in a class, say, hey, what do you think of this? Because maybe they're saying lists because they want you to get like 3 things that you're talking about, but really, guys, that's going to cap you with the way that you're viewed as a writer. Go beyond, even though I gave you a formula, like that formulaic writing. So this formula that I gave you is really just saying this, guys, get these components in there. Who's the audience precisely? What's the purpose? What's the writer generally do? One last question that I get a lot. A lot of students ask me either in my class or as I talk to other AP language students, isn't this kind of long for a sentence? And really, guys, it's totally fine if your thesis statement is pretty wordy and long if it's being purposeful. Let's look at mine again. Nothing really I should take out here. Nothing is being redundant, and this is not a run-on sentence. It has a prepositional clause at the beginning, and then a very clear Reagan does blank and blank. So let's look at it. In order to convince Americans of the importance of moving forward while mourning the tragic loss of these 7 astronauts, Reagan both celebrates the lives of those lost and recognizes the importance of keeping the space program's goals intact. It's thorough, but it's not overly wordy, and it's not by any means grammatically wrong. That's why I like using that in order to phrase, because it kind of gives you 2 halves of your sentence, which means you can be really thorough and cram a lot of really quality information in the most important sentence of your paper. That's going to, again, it's not required. There's no magic like, oh, you have a beautiful thesis, you get a point. But it's going to kind of target and hone in your AP reader under what you're going to talk about, and that you're not just being formulaic of uses X, Y, and Z. You're really owning a high-level reading of the text. That's what we're really looking for when we're reading your thesis and your whole essay. Do you have a good understanding of what, or this one, Ronald Reagan is doing and why? Let me just make a couple points here. Here's my great example. Here's a decent example. In order to convince Americans of the importance of moving forward while mourning the tragic loss of these 7 astronauts, then I get listy, listy, listy. Don't get listy, listy, listy. I see this all the time, guys. Every reader sees this for at least half of their essays. Uses X, Y, Z. Pathos, strong diction, and concrete evidence. That is not what we're looking for. We're looking for this. This is thinking. This is not, obviously it's thinking, but it's not high-level thinking. Every writer uses strong diction. Spoiler alert. Every writer, for the most part, they're going to read this year, uses some degree of pathos. This model thesis is talking about what actually is happening and really getting to like the importance. It goes back to what we're going to talk about next week, what is worth writing about. So these things are very intertwined. Okay, I see this all the time. This is a good thesis. Again, a lot of you write, I'm sure, good thesis statements. I want you to get to this level. Perfect. So here's the problem with this one. We see this all the time. You're just telling me the purpose, but you don't own, or you're just saying of his purpose. But you don't own that you understand and you know as the analyzer what his purpose is. Make sure your purpose statement is clear. So don't say something like, in order to convince Americans of his purpose. Because that doesn't, your job is to make me not ask questions as a reader. Pretend, like, let's say I haven't thought about the text very much. You're thinking about the text. I'm reading your thoughts. So don't assume like I've, as your reader, put in a ton of thought here. Obviously we have, but we're assessing your writing. So your writing is to show us that you don't, like, you understand it fully. My question, like, basically, guys, this is what I'm trying to say. Try to minimize your reader having to ask you a question. Your reader's not in front of you. It's not a one-on-one session, right? So if I was to read this, I would say, okay, what's his purpose? You don't want me to be thinking that as I'm reading your essay, so tell me what his purpose is. It's very similar, so I won't beat a dead horse here. Don't just vaguely say his audience in order to convince his audience of the importance of moving forward. So I got the purpose statement there. But again, my question, if I was sitting next to you, would be, okay, who's his audience? Tell me that in the writing. That's an easy fix. This is a very common thing that we see is vague statements in purpose or vague statements in audience. Easy fixes to make a perfect thesis statement here. Okay. Again, I just want to emphasize every single week, if you have a question, feel free to write that down or to post it on the bottom of your screen. And by the end, I will definitely get to every question. Even if I don't get it in the moment, I will definitely be checking those out and getting to them. And if it's, again, at the end of the session, I will go back and I will make sure I address it first thing next time. So we want to make sure Fiveable is for you. This is live tutoring, and I definitely want to be here to answer any questions. But let's jump in at this point to, we're not going to read this rhetorical analysis prompt, but this is the 2015 rhetorical analysis prompt. What I've typed up here is simply College Board's background info that they give you at the top before the speech. So I've said this before through Fiveable, but please read every word of what College Board provides at the top. That's context that they're giving you to give you some hints into what the purpose is. So let's take a minute to read this. We're actually not going to read the Chavez excerpt here. I'm just going to use this as a launching off point to give you another model thesis and kind of talk about some common flaws that students make when looking at a prompt like this. So let's read it together. On the 10th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., labor union organizer and civil rights leader Cesar Chavez published an article in the magazine of a religious organization devoted to helping those in need. Read the following excerpt from the article carefully. Then, in a well-written essay, analyze the rhetorical choices Chavez makes to develop his argument about nonviolent resistance. Okay, this is 2015, so it's pretty current. I want to really emphasize two words here before we move on to back to thesis statements. Rhetorical choices. That comes in like your call to action here as a reader and as a writer. College Board is asking you to analyze the rhetorical choices made. Old prompts before 2015, like there was, I forget what year, but they changed, and now they're just using, College Board is just using that term, like writing choices or rhetorical choices. It used to say rhetorical strategies. The reason College Board made that change is because they don't want you to be listy. They don't want you to say, all right, the three strategies he uses are repetition, pathos, and metaphor. What we want to get away from is that term, just like looking for terminology and getting into, now I'm going to talk a lot more about this next week, but getting into more of what my thesis statements look like. Big picture, what is the author doing? Sure, I can talk about repetition, but only under the umbrella of like the more important piece. Like what's he emphasizing through repetition, and how does repetition fit into the overall writing choice that he's making? Okay, so that was a little side note, kind of a preview for next week. Let's jump into, like, obviously the next step you would read, you make sure you understand, you identify the purpose. But let's look into how I would craft a thesis for this exact prompt. So what I get already from the background info is this quote. Chavez published this in an article in the magazine of a religious organization devoted to helping those in need. So what I can take away, and this is a nuanced way that I've worded it, a primarily religious audience. If I said his audience is Christians, well, that's true, but I just want to be a little bit more nuanced than that. Not every single person reading this might be, but that's certainly the target audience. So that's why I use the word primarily there. I'm just showing like I've got a nuanced understanding here. Let's be clear. The audience is not the religious organization. That's just the publisher. So the audience are readers of this religious magazine. So clearly, yeah, they're going to be mainly Christian readers. They're going to be mainly religious readers. But I'm going to use that word primarily intentionally because I don't want to say I'm assuming every single reader is a Christian, right? But I love that thought because if I said Americans, that's too broad. Remember, this is the Goldilocks rule. I don't want to be too specific. I don't want to be too broad. I want to be just right. So for Cesar Chavez's piece, it's published in a religious magazine. The sweet spot is primarily a religious audience. And you could totally say a religious American audience, right? That's right. But I don't want to say Americans or even worse, his audience. I want to get right into who the audience is. When I say don't get too specific, I mean don't like outthink yourself. Don't say like again the religious organization. That's too specific. That's inaccurate. The audience are readers of it. So that's what I mean when I say it's too specific. I think it's easier to understand what I mean when I mean don't be too broad. It's easy to say when your teacher asks you who's the audience of this piece, the world. I want you to be really specific on who the target demographic is for whoever is reading or listening to the speech or the work, right? If it's a speech, it's the people in the room or people watching if it's a televised speech. All right, now let's talk about purpose. Again, this is a quote from the background information. His argument about nonviolent resistance. All right, this is exactly what I talked about 10 minutes ago. This is the subject, nonviolent resistance. We need to read the text, which we're not doing today, but we would need to read it to see what his perspective is or his argument. I'll do that work for you. Obviously, y'all let's think about it. This is someone who's channeling Martin Luther King. That's what we just saw in the background info. So he's not going to come out and say, nonviolence is not the answer. So like my prediction before reading is he's going to agree with King. This is written on the anniversary of King's death. So yeah, that's what would happen. If you were to read this text, you would see that pretty clearly, hopefully. So here's the purpose. Chavez argues that nonviolence is the best long-term plan that will lead to the greatest outcomes. That's his purpose. His purpose is not his argument about nonviolent resistance. So when you're doing your purpose statement, it's going to be something like what I have in bold here. And I'll show you in a minute how we're going to tie these pieces together. But what I don't want to see is to achieve his purpose or to talk about nonviolent resistance. Those things are too broad. Actually answer. Again, if I was sitting next to you, I would say, okay, what's his purpose? And you'd answer to show that nonviolence is the best long-term plan. All right, this is the hard part. Something that you're not going to walk away with necessarily today feeling like I got this, I've mastered it, because it just takes deliberate practice all year. But I want you to start deliberately practicing this skill and getting teacher feedback. And if you ever want to ask them, like in the chat or in a question, like, hey, how would this sound? I am very willing to give you my feedback as well. So the general writing trend, and again, I know you haven't read this with me. Some of you will read this at some point, I'm sure, this year, the Chavez piece. But this is what I would say. Chavez juxtaposes the benefits of nonviolence with the drawbacks of violence. That's the big picture writing trend that he does. Again, I'm going to talk about a lot more of that in my body paragraphs. And again, in a few weeks, I'm going to show you like a beautiful rhetorical analysis body paragraph that can get you a 9. But I need to build you up to be thinking the right way. One quick side note here before I look at the thesis statement. Verbs are the key to success if you want to open doors to 8s and 9s. Your verbs need to be purposeful. Look at my verb here, juxtaposes. Juxtaposition is simply the side-by-side comparison of two different things, the deliberate comparison of two things. So clearly, nonviolence and violence are what is being compared. I could have said Chavez compares and contrasts nonviolence with violence, and that's right. I'm also focusing on a higher level, like expression of thought and language here. So verbs are often the key to more higher level thinking and nuanced perspectives. A verb that I teach my students they're not allowed to use is use. So don't just say uses juxtaposition. Go higher level than that. Juxtaposes. Don't say uses emotional appeal. Say appeals to the audience's sense of guilt, whatever it is. All right, so let's look at how we're tying in my identification of audience, purpose, and then the general writing trend. This is what my thesis would look like. Literally, if I was writing this essay, this is one of the sentences that I would say. It's not just one of the sentences, it's the most important sentences. It's the most important of the sentences that I would write. In order to convince his primarily religious audience that nonviolence is the ideal long-term course of action, Chavez juxtaposes the benefits of nonviolence with the drawbacks of violence. Boom, I've got it. So I've got audience, his primarily religious audience. I've got his purpose, that nonviolence is the ideal long-term course of action, and then the general writing trend. That's the thing I want you all working on, but please make sure you have, and that's we're going to leave here today knowing I need to get the purpose nailed, the audience, and the general writing trend I want to keep working at. All right, so we're going to do a practice round. This won't take nearly as long as last week, but I want to look at a very short and sweet text. It's actually a speech that a lot of AP classrooms use. The reason why, there's a lot of great things going on here, but it's a pretty short text, so we can look at it pretty quickly, get in and get out, and then we can go ahead and look at formulating a thesis around it. So it is valuable to take a little bit of time today. I'll do kind of what I did last week. Let's read Lou Gehrig's words. This is his luckiest man speech that when he was basically announcing, or basically it was his Lou Gehrig Appreciation Day. Everyone at the time knew, all the fans and the audience and kind of the nation knew that he had ALS. Now we call it Lou Gehrig's disease. It's the disease that was raising a lot of support just a few years back with the Ice Bucket Challenge. So a lot of us know about ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. He was one of the highest profile cases of it, and there wasn't like a ton of research on what it was. Like obviously our nation, our like international community is still doing some research on this disease. So he's addressing the audience on July 4th, 1939 at Yankee Stadium, at his home stadium, on Lou Gehrig Appreciation Day. Again, the audience knows very clearly this is his last season because he has ALS. Like he's got to be done, right? Because his body's going to start shutting down. So we're going to look at, like I did last week, let's look at Gehrig's words. Last week I did it with Reagan. And then let's look at just how to think like an AP, a college student. Once we think, we start to translate it into writing. So that's what we're going to start to do today just by looking at the thesis. That's pretty much all I got for you. I'll answer any questions if you have any. All right, so this is how Gehrig starts his speech. Let's read the left, and then I'll just kind of talk through my analytical thoughts very briefly with you all today. He says, for the past 2 weeks, you have been reading about a bad break. Yet today, I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth. I have been in ballparks for 17 years and have never received anything but kindness and encouragement from you fans. So first thing to note, guys, he is in his home turf, Yankee Stadium, surrounded by Yankees fans. My analytical thoughts here, he's talking directly to his audience, his fans. He's showing them appreciation and just remembering, like, he's setting the tone. He's just acknowledging, I know this is Lou Gehrig Appreciation Day, but I appreciate you all for giving me that appreciation, right? He's just kind of having that mutual respect and appreciation from the get-go. He touches on the bad break, but that's not where he's starting, really. He addresses it. He's like, I know you've read about this disease that I have, but let me focus on the positive. So he's clearly setting the tone for his speech. All right, next he says, when you look around, wouldn't you consider it a privilege to associate yourself with such a fine-looking men as they're standing in uniform in this ballpark today? Sure, I'm lucky. Who wouldn't consider it an honor to have known Jacob Rupert, also the builder of baseball's greatest empire, Ed Barrow? To have spent 6 years with that wonderful little fellow, Miller Huggins. Then to have spent the next 9 years with that outstanding leader, that smart student of psychology, the best manager in baseball today, Joe McCarthy. Sure, I'm lucky. So he's mentioning names that you might probably aren't familiar with, but clearly these are his teammates and members of the Yankee organization. He's just really taking time They're probably in the stadium or even on the field with him. All the fans would know these names obviously at the time. They're Yankees fans. So he's just showing them mutual gratification, gratitude. He wants them to know, okay, this was not just the fans who appreciate me, but I just have a lot going for me. I've been surrounded by these awesome people who, again, he's just aligning himself with his audience here. You respect Jacob, Rupert, Ed Barrow, etc. So do I. Keeping it positive and keeping himself aligned with the audience. And then he says, when the New York Giants, a team you would give your right arm to beat. In other words, guys, on the Yankees, they're the two New York teams. They were big rivals. So that's what he's meaning when he says a team you would give your right arm to beat, and vice versa. So big rivalry. So when the New York Giants sends you a gift, that's something. When everybody down to the groundskeepers and those boys in white coats remember you with trophies, that's something. He's shifting here. He's highlighting the professional appreciation that's been shown to him, both in his own, like, not just the ball players, but everyone working in the stadium down to like the groundkeeping level, etc. And other teams. Implicit here is that every team has appreciated Lou Gehrig. If his rival did, clearly the other teams did too. And that's kind of implicit in his argument here. I want to start to think like an AP student, like a college thinker. I noticed something here. He says a clause, and then he says that's something. He does that twice. That's an understatement, I think. Now, I'm not going to write Lou Gehrig uses understatement. I'm going to look for the bigger trend, but I can certainly talk about his use of understatement within that big trend. And again, this is what we're going to work on for the next few weeks. But what I'm noticing here is that he's emphasizing his gratitude through this understatement. He's kind of making the audience put themselves in. Okay, that's more than something, is what the audience is thinking. That's great. Everyone around you, Lou Gehrig, seems to appreciate you, even your most bitter rival. Now he's continuing to shift. So he goes from baseball. First he goes to Yankees. Then he goes to like broader career, rivals and other groundskeepers, etc. Now he goes to family. Let's go ahead and read the next part of the speech. When you have a wonderful mother-in-law who takes sides with you and squabbles with her own daughter, that's something. Okay, third time we saw that phrase, that's something. When you have a father and mother who work all their lives so you can have an education and build your body, it's a blessing. When you have a wife who has been a tower of strength and shown more courage than you dreamed existed, that's the finest I know. So again, he's showing his familial blessings and just the gratefulness he has for that. But let's look at those clauses. He goes from that's something to it's a blessing to that's the finest I know. That's emphasizing his like coming to acceptance, and I think just like showing his priorities that, yeah, it's something. But then he goes to it's a blessing. It's the finest I know when he's talking about his wife. So he's just coming very, very clearly, like layering his blessings. He's saying like, I don't just have baseball to be thankful for. I don't just have you fans. Because the fans obviously are going to know, yeah, we appreciate you, Lou Gehrig, but we don't know you on a personal level. So he's getting personal. And as he gets personal, his language changes. It goes from blessing to the finest I know. So it's emphasizing his life is surrounded by real blessings, not just superficial blessings, which he's not saying superficial is a bad thing there, but like superficial relationships between star athlete, and fans. He's saying, yeah, that's great. And I also have all these other layers of real blessings around me too. My whole life is one big bundle of blessings. That's what he wants the audience to understand. This is it. So I told you it's a pretty short speech. So I close in saying that I might have been given a bad break, but I've got an awful lot to live for. Thank you. All right, this is very important. A lot of people are like, hey, is that it? He didn't even talk about ALS. He didn't talk about, I can't play the game that I love, baseball, anymore. He said, yeah, I got a bad break. He said it twice. The audience knows what the bad break is. Instead of choosing time to talk about it, he spends his short speech focusing on the good, not the bad. So that's a very deliberate move on his part. All right, so let's talk about how to formulate a thesis. First, again, it's Lou Gehrig Appreciation Day. He is surrounded by Yankees fans who have watched him for years be like an all-star. So primarily, he's talking directly to his audience of fans. Now his purpose. Again, don't just say his purpose. Don't just say something that's kind of vague. Don't just say like, Gehrig conveys his message. None of that. Here's where we are. This is purpose. Gehrig reminds his audience of the importance of focusing on the positive aspects of our lives rather than the negative ones. Got it. And then here's the tough part that I want you to keep practicing. What's the general writing trend? We just read this together. Gehrig spends the majority of his speech highlighting the many blessings that exist in his life. Now, I'm going to tie all three of these together. Audience, purpose, trend. What I'm not doing is audience, purpose, repetition, understatement, and pathos, whatever, right? I'm looking at the writing trend. Here's what I would say. If I was to write a paper, an analytical paper on Lou Gehrig's short speech, this would be my thesis. In order to remind his fans of the importance of remaining positive, even in the face of difficulties, Gehrig recounts the many blessings that exist in his life. Again, I love that phrase in order to. I've got varied sentence structure because I'm starting with that prepositional clause. But that's not why this is an effective thesis. That's just icing on the cake. Here's the cake. Here are the core ingredients. I nailed the purpose statement. I got the precise audience figured out, his fans, easy. And then I figured out the general writing trend. He recounts so many blessings. Now, if I was to ask you, not to write this, but say like, hey, what did Gehrig do in his speech? If we were to have like a conversation that wasn't about, like, if we were to take the confines of the class out, that's what every single one of you would have told me. So we took the confines of AP and College Board out, and that's exactly what you would have told me. Okay, he talks about all the blessings he has. Absolutely. So what I'm challenging you all to do is say, okay, kind of forget you're in the class for just a minute and act like you were going to tell me or your teacher or your friend, whoever, what does the author do? Answer it. And then you're analyzing by talking, how does the author get his audience on his side or to believe what he believes? That's it. So obviously, we got to be careful, guys. If all we do is summarize, we're not going to score well. We're not doing the task. We're not analyzing. So that's what we're going to be focusing on next week. But I wanted to make sure we're leaving a good spot here. That writing trend is tough. I get that. It'd be easier to say X, Y, Z. Emotional appeal, repetition, and understatement. But that is capping your thought because that's all you're going to talk about then. Here, I know I'll teach you kind of how to organize. One really effective way to organize. Again, there's many ways you could do it to get a 9 on this 1 to 9 scale. But really, the writing trend is all you would tell me. Recounts the many blessings that exist in his life. Here's 4 final reminders, and then we'll start to wrap up here tonight. So reminder 1, the thesis statement is the most important sentence in your essay. That's never changed since middle school. That's true for argumentation, rhetorical analysis, and synthesis this year. We're going to perfect our thesis statements. My advice is keep it simple. Don't try to outthink yourself. Again, you don't have to take my advice on every single thing. I'm just going to give you what I think is the easiest way to get to that 9. My advice is just keep it like you've done it since middle school. Just make sure your thesis is better than it was in middle school, right? Write your thesis in the last sentence of your introduction paragraph. Keep it simple. Honestly, like that's the first place that we look as readers. When we read it, when we're done with your introduction, your first paragraph, we're like, okay, there's his or her thesis. Third, this is the most important part. Include the purpose. These are the ingredients, the audience, and a general trend of the writing choices made. And lastly, just make sure you're staying specific with the purpose and the audience. All right, so that's pretty much all we did tonight. I wanted to dedicate an entire live session to this because we're setting the tone for this is how important thesis statements are in our writing. Now, clearly, if I only have one sentence that's beautiful, I'm not going to have a beautiful score. But this is the place to start. So this should be your best sentence in your paper. You should put the most thought into this because really you're putting thought into the ingredients that you're going to talk about the rest of your essay. If you don't talk about purpose the rest of your essay, you're not going to have a great score. If you don't talk about the audience explicitly throughout the rest of your essay, you're not going to have a good score. And if you don't identify what's worth talking about, which is our entire live session next week, you're not going to have a good score. So you can write a pretty good essay on understatement, but that's not really what's worth talking about here. Like that's part of it, but that's not a whole body paragraph worth of your thoughts. So you could have a good paragraph, but not have a good score because you're not talking about what's worth talking about. That's where we're headed next week. So please keep in touch, keep coming back. We are continuing to do rhetorical analysis, a deep dive. Now, let me kind of get going, wrapping up here, making sure we've got everyone on the same page. So just some last thoughts here. I hope you're all with me. Again, ask any questions that you got. Looks like I've answered any that we had tonight. What I really want to focus on is make this practical. So we're still kind of in the clouds, like theoretical. I want you deliberately practicing practically in your classes. What I care about for you all is please give me feedback as to how I can serve the people in the live session, and also if you're watching the replay, reach out. Live session, I'll get the feedback quicker, obviously, but reach out. Let's make sure we're doing this thing together. If you're like, hey, that's not going to work for me, tell me why, or like ask questions like, that's not going to work, but here's another thought I had. I am super willing to talk to each one of you on an individual basis to get this more practical. Again, next week we're going to get practical on identifying what's worth talking about. That is the most important step for rhetorical analysis. After that, we're going to get into even more practical parts of actually like looking at a model body paragraph that I've written, a model intro paragraph that I've written, and then it's just up to you in class as you're working all year on these things to try to like meet me at that model. I'm giving you what a 9 looks like in pieces, obviously, but your goal is to meet that or even exceed my model, right? My model is just the easiest way to get to a 9. Easiest way, like it's easier said than done, right? But just a quick way, like these are the ingredients, but I can't think for you, your teacher can't think for you, your friend can't think for you. It's all about thinking like a college student, like thinking like a really quality thinker. Once you do that, it's all about putting it into writing. All right, everybody, thank you for your time tonight. We're going to end it here. Again, reach out if you have any questions between now and next Tuesday, and I hope I see you back next Tuesday as we keep working through this analytical writing. Thanks, everybody.